Hopefully I'll have plenty of material to fill the class, but I have a few things. So let's go ahead and look at verses 1 through 3 of chapter 13. On that day, they read aloud from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and there was found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So when they heard the law, they excluded all foreigners from Israel. All right, so they were reading from the law, and they come to this part, which is in Deuteronomy, the 23rd chapter, that says that no people from the Moabites or the Ammonites should ever come into the assembly of God. And what was the reason given for that? All right, so the reason given is because they hired this fellow named Balaam. And so we're going to just real quick, without going back and looking at it. So the children of Israel were coming across through the wilderness. They were entering the land of Canaan, and the Moabites and the Ammonites see that, and so they try to go out, and they want to hire this prophet of God named Balaam to come and curse the children of Israel. All right, so they're going to try to use a prophet of God to curse God's people. And we all are familiar, or mostly familiar. I can remind you of the story. So this Balaam, he goes and he wants to go there. And so long story short, he goes, and when he goes to curse the people, he stands on the mountain over top of them. And God has, through some means, told him he can't say anything that he didn't tell him to say. And these kings have hired him to curse them. And whenever he comes there, what does he do? He blesses them. So God won't allow him to curse them. And so we see that God took what they intended to be evil for God's people, and he turned it around and made it good. And you remember, if that made the kings happy, right? We've paid you to do this, and you do the opposite of what we've paid you to do. And they keep taking him different spots, and he keeps doing the same thing over and over. In the end, eventually, Balaam tells them, if you want God to curse his people, you got to get them to sin. And so they send out, their women, try to get them to intermarry. And so he calls them to sin that way. So because of the action of these people, God has excluded them from being in his presence, or being in the presence of the worship assembly. And so they read this, and guess what? They have those people there in their presence. Sounds like they have them in the assembly of God. And they've, as we have read and we'll read in this passage, they've already taken some of them to be their spouses, right? Excuse me. And so they're going to go and they're going to follow the law, and they're going to exclude them, as they come in to read the law and to worship God. So they're going to exclude them. Any other thoughts or comments on this section? All right, let's look at verses 4 through 9 then. Now, prior to this, Eliashib, the priest who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, being related to Tobiah, had prepared a large room for him, where formerly they put grain offerings, the frankincense, the utensils, and the tithes of grains, wine, oil, prescribed for the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priest. During all this time, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king after some time. However, I asked leave from the king, and I came to Jerusalem and learned about the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah by preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. It was very displeasing to me, so I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. Then I gave an order, they cleansed the rooms, and I returned there the utensils of the house of God with the grain offerings and the frankincense. All right, do you all remember who Tobiah was? All right, he was an Ammonite. So he is in this group of people that's supposed to be excluded from the children of Israel because he's one of the Moabites and Ammonites. He's supposed to be excluded from them. All right. Do you remember anything else about Tobiah? Had he been their friend? All right. He had plotted against them, right? He had plotted against Nehemiah. They had even tried to lure Nehemiah out into the wilderness, they're going to call it, or an area where it's secluded, so that they could murder him. They had lied against him. They had came and tried to discourage the people as they were building the walls. Mike?
This information here gives a whole lot of context to like why Tobiah was such a thorn in their side, and really how deeply entrenched he was into the community. If he had a place here, that's the kind of influence he had in the whole city.
All right, so as Mike points out, he had a lot of influence with the city, right? And so, a few of the questions I have is, why does Tobiah want this room in there in the temple anyway? All right, it seems that he wants to have some kind of political control or influence over the people, probably for his personal gain or sometimes men have this desire for power. If somebody wanted to have control in our government, they might want maybe a room in a little office in the Congress, right? Down the hall from, some of the senators and those people. Somebody like that would want those controls. So that might be why he wants that. So there's a lot of problems with him being there, right? First of all, he's supposed to be excluded because of he's an Ammonite. He clearly is not their friend, right? So they've let an enemy come in and have this room in the temple. What was the purpose of this room in the temple? All right, so it tells us here that these rooms, if you remember, I think it was last week we talked about how the children of Israel brought tithes to the Levites, and the Levites took tithes to the priests, and they put those things in storerooms in the temple so that they could use them in the worship service. And it also says here that they stored, it kind of gives a list here of some of the stuff they had in here. They had the grain offerings, frankincense, utensils, grain, oil. So this is kind of like we're going to call it a storage room in the temple for the utensils, bowls, things they would carry the oil in, keep the oil in, keep the oil. So we have this storage room so that they can carry out the worship of God. Do you all have a storage room at your office or your home? It's really not that important of a room, right? But it has a purpose, right? If we took away the storage room, now and used that for something else, you've changed the purpose of that room. And so I want to think about that. So this, somebody say something? Exactly. You did probably a better job making the point I was trying to make. This room has a purpose, even though it's not a glamorous type room, right? It's not like the place where they do that, but it has a purpose in the service of God, and it was dedicated for that specific purpose. So this is not just like, even though it probably was kind of inconspicuous, maybe, and it had a specific purpose. And so I want to look at and think about something. Let's look at 1 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter. In we'll read verses 16 and 17. It says, "Do you not know that you are a temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? And if any man destroys the temple of God, God will destroy him. For the temple of God is holy, and that is what you are. So here we see, I think we can make a comparison between that temple was holy, and they were letting Tobiah stay in there for unholy purposes. Storing those things in that room was for holy purposes. We can see that, right? To aid them in the worship of God. Tobiah is in there for political purposes of his own desire. He's even an Ammonite. He's not even allowed to be in there. All right, so we can all look at that and say that is wrong for them to let him in there, right? Anybody think it's a good idea? All right. We don't have the temple anymore, right? We don't have rooms to store these, but we have, what is the temple now, it says? We are the temple. All right, now I want to think about us having rooms in our temple. Do we store things in those rooms that are appropriate, beneficial to God, service to God? Or do we store things in those rooms in our hearts and in our minds, things that are inappropriate, things that are sinful, things like an Ammonite, Tobiah, being in our room? So I think the point I'm trying to make, I guess, hopefully I'm making it clear. Whenever we take our temple and we engage in unholy activity, whenever we use it for sin, we are misusing God's temple the same way they were misusing it by letting Tobiah live there. And so I think it's, we have this idea of something, that, if we have this sin in our life, it's kind of part of our life. We can't be split both ways. And so what we see them doing is, I don't know if I've read that part yet. Oh yeah, I think I have. He takes all of Tobiah's stuff, throws it out of the room, right? And then they cleanse the room. The idea, I think the Jews were very big on this cleansing. Some of it was ceremonial. Some of it may just been because they wanted to be clean. So we see that they removed Tobiah and his things from that room, cleanse it, and then they replace it with the things that were supposed to be there. All right, now let's think about us. We have something in our temple that is unholy. What should we do with it? Just make it a little bit smaller, right? No, as Dad says, we throw it out. Cleanse it. So now it's gone. What do? Now we need to replace it with something that is holy. And so we see that I think that we can make that comparison, I think, pretty easily because of the passage we have that we are God's temple. Now, can you all think, here's another thought. Can you all think of anybody else in biblical history that went into the temple and saw it being used for something that was inappropriate and then gathered up their stuff and threw it out? Jesus did, right? When was that? All right, so they were using the temple to sell the sale place. They were using it as a marketplace to sell the sacrifices. And there's a lot of idea that they were, overcharging people, but what they were doing is they were using the temple for something that it was not intended to be used for. It was not a market. And that's what they were using it for. And so we see this upsets Jesus to the point where he overturns the tables and throws them all out. And so that's another example of a reason I think we need to get these things out of our lives or out of our temples. Yes.
Paul says in 2 Corinthians 10:5, we are destroying speculations, every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God, and taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. And so, even the thoughts, he says, we need to be careful what those thoughts are against eventually he tempted to become action. But giving Satan no foothold whatsoever within that. Because he can take a half inch of build fortress on a half inch of the heart.
Right. And so, yeah, keeping those thoughts, and that's hard to do, isn't it? Do y'all ever have evil thoughts? Am I the only one that ever has thoughts that I shouldn't have? We got to, push those out and try to replace those with thoughts that are good and clear.
I can't believe somebody also says that you remove the evil and you don't replace it with the good, then you're going to risk the evil coming back into the position in the world.
Exactly. That's if they hadn't maybe put the stuff back in the room where Tobiah was, he may just give the stuff back and put it back in there, right? And so we have to replace that with things that are good and pure. All good comments. Anybody else have any thoughts? All right, let's look at verses 10 through 14. I also discovered that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them. So the Levites and the singers who performed the service had gone away, each to his own field. So I reprimanded the officials and said, "Why is the house of God forsaken?" Then I gathered them together and restored them to their post. All Judah then brought the tithe of grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. In charge of the storehouses, I appointed Shelemiah the priest, Zodak the scribe, and Pedaiah of the Levites. In addition to them was Hanan, the son of Zakur, the son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable, and it was their task to distribute to their kinsmen. Remember me this, O my God, and do not blot out my loyal deeds, which I have performed for the house of my God and its services. So at some point, maybe while Nehemiah's up there trying to refill the room that Tobiah had occupied, he realizes what? Where are all the tithes? He's looking around. All these rooms are empty. They should be full of the grain and the oil and the offerings. Why are these rooms empty? And where are the singers? Where were the singers? They had gone back out and started farming, right? So this is the idea that the people were supposed to be bringing these tithes so they could have these singers and they could have all this stuff to offer, and it wasn't there. It was fact, it was so bare that the people who were supposed to be getting it had decided, hey, we're going to starve to death. We better get to work, right? If you go to your job and all of a sudden your paycheck quits coming, what are you going to do? Your paycheck bounces 2 or 3 weeks in a row. What are you going to do? You're going to find a new job, right? We got to survive. So they had gotten so bad that they had left and gone out and started farming so that they could take care of themselves. And so if you remember, these people had dedicated themselves to do this at this big ceremony they had. And they were failing to do it. They were not able to keep it up. They had failed. Dempsey?
Nehemiah specifically said, like Nehemiah back in verse 4, and a lot of the fault was him because he was a steward, but he was an unfaithful steward of that job. He was proven untrustworthy. Couldn't trust him anymore with that job. And so it fell again that Goliath. And then here he makes the point, these guys are reliable. They're stewards and they're trustworthy stewards. I think it's important that, sometimes someone's asked to do something, they're a steward of that. They're trustworthy of that. And we want to be proven trustworthy in the job, whatever it may be.
And it may be the fact that the reason that the Jews had quit bringing these tithes there is because they saw what was going on. They saw it was being maybe misused. Maybe Tobiah was stealing it. And if Tobiah's going to steal it, why are we going to take tithes up there if they're just going to misuse it, right? And so it may have been for that. So now he's going to appoint people that are reliable and people are going to trust them. And so it doesn't specifically say that's what's going on, but we could maybe it was. That's all, that's all us just kind of taking a guess of why. But we see that the priest was not doing it responsibly by letting Tobiah in there. And now he's going to appoint some people that are responsible and are going to take it seriously. All right, let's look at verses 15 through 22 then. In those days, I saw in Judah some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys as well as wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads. And they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them on the day they sold food. Also the men of Tyre were living there who imported fish and all kinds of merchandise and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Did not your fathers do the same so that our God brought on us this city all this trouble? Yet you are adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And so here we see that if you remember in previous chapters, they were going to start honoring the Sabbaths. They weren't going to let the foreigners come in and trade. They weren't going to buy for them. But now what have they done? They're doing that to the point where they're even, trading, doing this work themselves on the Sabbath. So it says they're profaning the Sabbath. And then he confronts them and he reminds them that this is one of the reasons why God carried us into captivity in the very beginning. If you go back and look at some of the stuff that's written about that, is that God was going to carry them He's going to carry them so that the land could have all of its Sabbaths. And so that God had set these times for them not to work and not to do these things. And then they continue to do it. And so part of their punishment was based on maybe some of the time that they hadn't done this. And so we see that God had wanted this done and they weren't doing it. And so to them it was sin, and it was one of the reasons that they were punished. And they've gone right back to doing it. They haven't been back in Jerusalem very long, and they're still not serving God the way he wants them to. And so he confronts them about it. And then in we'll read verse 19 through 22. And it came about that just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I commanded the doors should be shut, and they should not open them until after the Sabbath. Then I stationed some of my servants at the gates so that no load would enter on the Sabbath day. Once or twice, traders of merchants of every kind of merchandise spent the night outside of Jerusalem. Then I warned and said to them, why do you spend the night in front of the wall? If you do so again, I will use force against you. From that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath, and commanded the Levites they should purify themselves, come as gatekeepers to sanctify the Sabbath day. For this also remember, O my God, and have compassion on me according to greatness of your loving kindness. So here we see that he was so serious about this that he was going to physically prevent the foreigners from being able to come in and trade on the Sabbath. That he closes the gate. If you can imagine, let's just put ourselves in the position of one of these foreigners. You're carrying your goods from wherever. Some of them were coming from Tyre with some fish, which I bet that was really, really fresh. So you've come, and you probably can't plan out your trip quite as easily as we can today. Like you can look in your phone, it's going to take me 8 hours to get here. So they're traveling, and they finally get there on the Sabbath day and the gates are shut. So what are they going to do? They're going to set up outside. We're just going to wait. But he goes to the point where he says, don't even come close to the city. If you do, I'm going to use force against you. So he pushes them out so that the people won't even be, because it would be maybe tempting to let them in, right? Oh, please let me in. I've been traveling 14 days. So he tells them not even to come near the city, so that way they're not even tempted to do that, so they can keep this Sabbath. Any thoughts or comments on this? All right, let's look at verses 23 through 29 here. In those days also I saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Remember the Ammonites and the Moabites? They weren't supposed to have anything to do with those people because they plotted against them. But now they're marrying them. As for their children, half spoken the language of Ashdod, and none of them was able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. So I contended with them and cursed them and struck them, some of them, and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, you should not give your daughters to their sons, nor take their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among many nations there was no king like him. And he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. Do we then hear about that you have committed all this great evil by acting unfaithfully against our God, by marrying foreign women? Even one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Elishbai, the high priest, was son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. So I drove him away from me. Remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. So here we see that they've married all these people from these cities, from Ashdod. As I understand it, Ashdod is a city that would have been in where the Philistines lived. I guess that's maybe now like close to the Gaza Strip. And so some of it says half of their children even spoke the language and couldn't speak their language. And one of the thoughts behind that is that if you had married a foreign wife that spoke the language of Ashdod, maybe the men would be out working all day in the fields, and the children would be there in the day with their mothers, and the mothers would be speaking their natural native tongue, and that's what the children had learned. And so they had intermarried so much that the children didn't even speak their language; they spoke the foreign languages.
The other sign that is, mothers would not be teaching them about Jehovah, they would be teaching them Hebrew about Yahweh, and so therefore they were going away from God because they didn't understand about Yahweh.
Exactly. So if we're not teaching them the language, they're teaching them about their gods, right? And then he goes on to compare them to Solomon. All right. Solomon, we know that, remember, he asked for wisdom from God, right? And God blessed him with great wisdom to where it says that he was the wisest man that ever lived. All right. So the wisest man that ever lived was clearly had better judgment and better wisdom than they do and than I do. And he said, Solomon, being this wise, when he married foreign wives, was unable to not fall away. It didn't keep him from sinning, didn't cause problems with his children worshiping idols. How do you think you can go down that path and not have the same consequence? Now, to compare that to us today, sometimes it's easy to get close to sin, right? And say, I can resist that. It's not going to affect me. But we know that's just foolishness, because it will. No, it's because you can look back in history and see through the Bible and just through our own men that were God's servants that got involved in some type of sin. And it just overtook them, right? And carried them away from God. And so if they couldn't resist it, what makes us think we can? It's, I think, one of the thoughts that we can get from that. Any thoughts or comments on that section? All right, let's look at the last verses here. It says, thus I purified them from everything, foreign and appointed duties for the priests and the Levites, each in his task. And I arranged for the supply of wood at appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, oh my God, for good. So we see that now that Nehemiah has returned, he reestablishes the way things ought to be going. He reestablishes the fact that the children of Israel are bringing in their tithes and the things. He gets the Levites doing their job again, each in his task. And then he talks about he arranged for the supply of firewood to happen again. Remember we talked about that last week? How they had set up times for certain people to bring firewood so these offerings could be burnt. It seems like none of this stuff was happening while he was gone. And so the people had fallen away, fallen down their duties. So he reestablished it, refreshes everybody, gets everybody back doing their jobs again. And then at the end of each one of these sections, I don't know if y'all have noticed, he kind of gives this, you call it a little prayer or a request from God. At the end of this is, remember me, oh my God, for good. I think he's trying to say, I'm not doing this for me. I'm doing this for God. So remember that, God. Remember me, not that I want to be famous or anything, but remember me because I'm doing this for you. Does anybody have any thoughts on this last section here, or even the whole book of Nehemiah?
I got a question about 13, the whole chapter. It seems, do you think that this is happened at the end of the technology, or is this, because some parts of it read like this is maybe a snapshot of the whole time period? Does that question make sense? That maybe these reforms have kind of gone on the whole time, not here at the very end.
Just because of the way I think of things being chronological. I also think because it talks about him having returned, I think that they just keep doing the same things over and over again. And also the fact that they had given this fellow Tobiah this room after he left and came back. That's just how I see it. I don't know if anybody has a different opinion. I know ancient writings, they sometimes mess around with chronological stuff. I don't. I'm very, very much a Westerner in my linear thinking. Any other thoughts or comments? All right, I want to kind of just maybe look at, we have a few minutes left here. We've obviously finished the chapter. We've got about 15 minutes or so. Nehemiah starts out, he comes back to Jerusalem and he sees the shape that the walls are in, and he goes around, surveys it. He encourages the people to build the wall. You take a bunch of people that don't have wall building skills, and guess what they're able to do? They're able to work together, and they have some problems, and they overcome them, but they build a wall. It's very much like us today, right? We have a group of people in God's church. We may not be the most skilled at everything, but you know what we can do? We can work together to fulfill God's purposes. We can overlook each other's shortcomings, right? Not that, you know, I'm talking about skills and that kind of thing. We can overlook some of that kind of stuff and work together. And we see when they did that, they were able to restore these walls of Jerusalem. And kind of one of the things I want to kind of focus on, after they had successfully built those walls, you remember what they did? They were going to have Ezra read them the law, right? And they all come in there inside the city. It seems like they're sitting there. And have y'all ever been to a historical place where things happened a long time ago, maybe? I remember we went to Williamsburg, and don't ask me I think we watched a reenactment out of the same room where they voted to secede from, you know, the England. We watched a reenactment. It was kind of like awe-inspiring, right? This is where it happened. Well, guess where these people are sitting? They're sitting in Jerusalem, city of David. You know, Solomon All the great kings had been there. This was God's kingdom. The God's people are there. And so they're sitting there. Do you think that would be kind of awe-inspiring? Not only is that history, but they're part of it, right? And then Ezra is going to get up there and he starts reading. And remember what the people did? It doesn't say that he told them to do this. The people stood up when he started reading the law. And they had probably heard, portions of it. They had been taught part of by their family. But I'm going to say Ezra got it. He started reading, and I don't know where he started, but he may have started in Genesis 1:1, right? He may have got up there and said, in the beginning. And so we see he gets up and he does that. He maybe comes down and he starts talking about Abraham, the promises God made to Abraham. And that's really got to give those people an identity, right? Because they're there. Those are the descendants of Abraham, God's chosen people. They're in Jerusalem. And so you can see how that would be this moment of, good feeling that they would have. But do you remember what happens? As he reads the law, what do they start to realize? Maybe he gets to the 10 Commandments. And he says, thou shalt have no other gods before me. They're like, oh man, we've been worshiping this idol. Thou shalt not use the Lord's name in vain. Oh, we've done that. Thou shalt not lie. Oh, we've done that too. And what do they start doing? Remember what they started doing? They started crying, right? Weeping. Why? Because they realized they had transgressed and broken God's law. And you remember what, I can't remember if it was Ezra or Nehemiah, what does he tell them? What does he come and say to them? It's over in verse 8. He tells them in verse 8, then he said to them, go eat of the fat of the sweet and send portions to him who has nothing prepared, for this day is holy to our Lord. Do not be grieved. So he tells them not to be grieved, but this day is holy to God. And so he also tells them another thing in there that I found kind of interesting. At the end of this, he says, do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. I think there's part of the reasons I think they know they needed God, because they got the walls built, right? And they know that's not going to be sufficient enough for them to be able to keep away their enemies. They need God in the temple, right? Because God was really the one that protected them. It wasn't so much the walls. But he says that the joy of the Lord is your strength. Whenever we like to talk about joy, whose joy do we like to talk about? I like to talk about my joy, right? And there is precedence for that, because we know in Philippians it tells us to rejoice in the Lord. We are to have joy, right? But whose joy is this talking about? It's about God's joy, right? And so I want to look at just a few passages here. Let's look at Isaiah 65 and verse 19. It says, I will also rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. And there will no longer be heard in her the voice of weeping and the sound of crying. So here's the idea of God rejoicing in his people. He will be glad in his people. Look at a passage in John, the 15th chapter. in verse 11, we'll begin in verse 10. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things I have spoken to you so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be made full. So here he tells us that if we keep his commandments and abide in his love, put my glasses back on, so that my joy may be in you. Here we see that if we keep God's commandments, his joy will be in us. And we see that that's what's going to give those Israelites their strength. That's what's going to give us our strength too, right? That's what's going to give us the power to overcome death, right? And also let's look in Luke, the 15th chapter. In verse 7, I tell you that in the same way, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. So here we see this idea that there's joy and celebration in heaven when one sinner repents. And so here at this day here in Jerusalem, when they've come to read the law, the people have a repentant heart, right? So there's joy in heaven, and that's going to be their strength when they turn to God, because they're going to be pleasing to him. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions about this? I just thought that was something I didn't, really pick up or talk about as we went through it the first time. But to me, that is almost the central theme of the whole book of Nehemiah right there. Their strength comes through God's joy in them, because he is going eventually to send his son to endure the cross. And I don't have the passage, but I think it says that it's my joy is for you. God was able to endure that cross because of his joy to know that it's going to save his people. And so what should that motivate us to do? Be pleasing to the Father? If we do that, that's going to bring him joy. There's going to be rejoicing in heaven. And in turn, that's going to give us strength, the kind of strength that we can't get from this world. That's all I have prepared for class. Anybody have anything they want to add or take away? All right, I thank you all for your participation. And I guess Matt will be taking over next week.